Okay, so now that we've gone over, why momentum is the most important factor, I want to give some tips on how I think you should defend the deep ball, uh, and how to prevent yourself from getting beaten deep, especially even if you're guarding someone who's a really strong deep cutter. So the three tips that I'm going to give, and then we're going to break down some clips of some of our players playing, and how they kind of illustrate or don't illustrate these keys. The first tip I would give is that the strength of the deep cutter determines your depth and positioning. Okay, so when I say the word strength, I mean how good would that person's deep cut be if they were to make it in that time, at that point in time. So, obviously there's some really strong deep cutters that we play. The ones I mentioned in the previous video where they can create a really strong deep cut standing still kind of out of nothing. But strength also uh, is determined by the situation that the cutter has put themselves in. So if a cutter, even if they're not the strongest deep cutter, is moving downfield and the thrower has just gotten in power position and they're putting all their momentum going towards the end zone, that's a really strong deep cut, even if it isn't made by one of those cutters. And so the strength of that deep cut is still pretty strong. So the stronger the deep cut is, the more depth you need in your positioning. And when I say depth, I mean the more you want to force them under, right? So if a really strong deep cutter is moving and the thrower just gets in a power position, you want to position yourselves like a good ways deeper than they are ideally. So that way, if they do go deep, you give yourself a couple of yards to work with to maintain your positioning. On the other side of that coin, if it's not a strong deep cutter, you can be aggressive about being level with them or even being underneath them and forcing them out. And you can generate blocks or you can make it hard for them to generate undercuts while also generating good block opportunities when they do go deep. A small corollary to this is that you still should try to never be too deep. And we'll watch a clip on this, but when you give the deep cutter 5 yards, sometimes even in some of these clips, 8 yards, 10 yards of space, even though you're kind of extinguishing that deep cut, you're giving them so many yards to move underneath without pressuring that undercut that it's going to be really hard for the defense to play because you're just giving up those free yards. And as we'll watch on one of these clips, even though you're giving up that yards, in order to close that gap, you're going to have to commit your forward momentum to going in the up direction away from the end zone the offense is trying to score in. And that's going to allow them to potentially run like a double move on you and still beat you going deep. So tip number one, the strength of the deep cutter determines your depth and positioning, but don't be too deep. Tip number two, don't point your hips down. So we talked about momentum. How quickly can you go in all directions? And when you're standing still and you point your hips down, like away from the direction that the cutter will be trying to go when they go deep, you're like losing a step, even though you haven't positioned yourself differently. Because in order to go deep, you now have to completely turn around, and that's about a step's worth of time. So especially when you have a defender who might be facing you, so they might even be looking at their end zone ready to go and you're facing the wrong direction, or a lot of times they're facing kind of perpendicular so they can go in either direction really quickly. If you're facing with your back towards the end zone, you're going to be a little slower to get deep, even though your positioning might be a little bit better. And then finally, number three, and this one is my favorite, and it's one that I think we are going to emphasize next year when you're guarding a strong deep cutter, is when they do cut under, you want to attack the outside shoulder when they make their undercut. What is more in vogue now is to attack the inside shoulder. And the reason for that is because I think it generates better block opportunities for you when they're cutting under. But the problem is, and we'll illustrate this with some of our clips, is that when you attack the inside shoulder, you make it a lot easier for that deep cutter to turn their undercut into a deep cut because they can turn without you being in position to defend them, and they can go deep. So when you're guarding a strong deep cutter, I think sacrificing, some of your under block ability, but like preventing them from turning to make it to turn their undercut into a deep cut is a better strategy than trying to go for that under block where you lay out past them and get it on that undercut.